So how did you end up getting into writing and editing science fiction?
Well, I always wanted to. I mean, I was writing really bad short SS stories, and by short I mean maybe 1,000 words. Um, all the way back when I was starting out in fandom. It was always in the back of my mind. Somewhere around 1953 or 54, Marion Bradley told me that my stories had good ideas and that needed to be developed, and that was encouraging. And well, it goes back to my writing for the jazz field. Uh, I was going full blast with metronome. Then I met this guy who was a jazz record producer, the man who discovered Cecil Taylor, among others, who was doing a radio show in New York City, a jazz programming from 6 p.m. to midnight every night on one of the non-commercial New York City FM stations. And they put out a little guide to go with it called Jazz Guide. And when I got the first one in the mail, I called him up and said, like to come talk to you about writing something for you. And the day I met him was the day that first issue of Metronome with me and it came out. So he was primed. He asked me to do a column for it. And I was doing that. I mean, we did a bunch of different things. But I had a conversation with one of the other young jazz critics, a friend of mine, while we were sitting in the 5 spot one night. And we agreed that there was enough money for jazz writers in the field to support 3 or 4 of us. But there were actually closer to a dozen of us, including the really big names like Matt Henkoff and Leonard Feather, who you're also talking about things like liner note assignments. Liner notes went for 75 to $100 a liner note. I did a few, but there just wasn't enough to support me. I had to do something else. Metronome folded, and the last editor of Metronome started a magazine called Jazz, which later became known as Jazz and Pop. And I wrote for it for its first year or two. In fact, some of the stuff I wrote for it is still in publication in books. But there was no future in it. I could see the handwriting on the wall. So I had to think about writing something else if I was going to stay in writing. And so science fiction was a logical and inevitable next step. And I've told this story before about how one day I was walking down 7th Avenue with a friend of mine, and we were talking about what we liked about A.E. Van Vogt's Better Stuff. We analyzed the components that we thought made it work and made it memorable. And when I got back to my apartment, I said to myself, let's try something here. And I sat down. At that time, I was not at town hall where all my main typewriters was, so I was using a portable on the kitchen table in my apartment. And I banged out 3 or 4 very short chapters, like 3 or 4 page chapters. I tried to adhere to the new idea every 800 words, which is a Van Goghian thing. And I was going for what I call a classic paranoid plot. They really are out to get you. That one. Slam, in other words. So I wrote this opening. That would have been in the summer of 1960, I guess. Well, it would have been 61. Might have been 61, probably was. and then it just sat there. I didn't continue. I had gotten enough down on paper that I kind of knew that it was started, it was established. I could pick it up later. Well, the following spring, I went through a lot of personal turmoil in my life involving the ending of my first marriage. And I found myself in this apartment in New Haven, Connecticut, uh, with about with an afternoon basically to kill and nothing to do. And the owner of the apartment had a small portable typewriter, kind that's not much larger than a large phone book used to be. And out of boredom, I opened it up, cranked a sheet of paper into it, and just started typing. And the first words I typed were about somebody's body being on fire. And I just took it from there, and I wrote a good deal. I wrote what was potentially three-quarters of a short story, not the ending. Wasn't even sure what the ending should be. And then that weekend was over, and I went back to Brooklyn, and I was by myself. And I had been thinking on the drive back to Brooklyn about how to finish the story, and I did. And I called it Phoenix, and I sent it to several magazines, and they all rejected it. And so then I sent it to Marion Bradley and said, "You remember how you once told me that someday you'd like to collaborate with me? Here's a story that I've written. It's been rejected by X, Y, and Z. See what you can do with it if you like it enough to do anything with it." And she ran it through a typewriter and made small, she didn't make any significant changes, but she made improvements. And she retitled it New Phoenix. And sent it to her agent, which I think was Scott Meredith at the time. And Scott sold it to Amazing Stories. And before that had sold, while all this was still in process, but after I'd sent the story to Marion, I dug out this opening to this Van Goghian novel that I'd written. And I should say that Bob Tucker was always a huge influence on me, not least for the way in which he could mine his material. He could write a short story that was a good, valid short story, and then he could use that as the opening chapter of a novel that went in another direction. And he did this several times. I know Long Loud Silence was one of them. So it was always in the back of my mind that I could refine a short story out of this Van Goghian novel opening. And so I did. I rewrote it as a short story, but having very little confidence in my ability as a prose stylist, I asked Terry Carr if he would like to look at it and run it through his typewriter. Now, at this point, Terry had sold several stories to FNSF, and Terry and I had been longtime fanish collaborators. We've done Void together. And when I say collaborator, I mean we occasionally wrote bits of each other's editorials. So we had a really good relationship in that sense, and in others as well. And so I gave the story to him, and he ran it through his typewriter. And I don't know whether he marketed it or I marketed it, but Fred Pohl bought it for If. And I got word of the sale of both of these stories the same day, which was in August of 1963. And I have no idea to this day which one was my first sale. And this was not helped by the fact that they were both published pretty much simultaneously. The issues of If and Amazing both came out on my newsstand the same day in January of 64.
Well,
Only
that's not a bad problem to have.
years. They changed the years. It was 62 and 63, not 63 and 64. So it was in January 63 that both stories were published. So it's a tie. They're both my first story. And they both became books because New Phoenix became Phoenix Prime, which was originally just a working title, but Larry Shaw and I decided we both liked it as a title. And the other story, which is called I Executioner, was ultimately published as Android Avenger by Ace Books. My title was The Murder Machine, which Don Wollheim said, that doesn't sound like science fiction. That sounds like a mystery. It's got to sound like science fiction. So it did.
So you were then, by that point, you were in Brooklyn, and where you were for the rest of your New York career. And when I came into fandom in the mid 60s, I met you through the Fanoclasts, which you hosted. You were the center of. And of course, the Fanoclasts were in the process of organizing to put on the 1967 Worldcon, Icon 3, which you were co-chair.
Yeah.
Talk about that a bit.
All right. Well, there are so many different places I could start. Let's start with the fact that St. Louis had their first convention in many years, a couple of years before that. And they asked me to be the guest of honor. And this was Ray Fisher and his wife, and
Joyce. Joyce Fisher.
and they didn't really know much. I mean, Ray had been a fan in 6 fandom days. He published a fanzine called Odd, which was one of the more fanish fanzines of its era. But they had been totally out of touch with fandom for maybe 10 years. And they didn't really know much about putting on a con. There were no evening parties or anything. It was just a program. But we got to know them there, and we became friends with them and the other people in St. Louis fandom. And we boosted the Couches in particular in their subsequent Worldcon bids, which they got for 69. And in turn, they were very helpful boosting us in our Nikon 3 and 67 bid. Worked behind the bar in room parties and things like that. A lot of volunteering on our behalf. So on one level, I feel this is sort of a connection between New York fandom and St. Louis fandom in that period. But the reason that we decided to bid for a Worldcon was that a whole bunch of us had gone to a PhillyCon, the annual regional Philadelphia conference. And we'd all gone in my Chevy Greenbrier van, which could carry 9 people comfortably. I had 3 forward or backward facing bench seats. And we had a pretty full van for those trips to and from conventions, to PhillyCons, to displays, all that kind of thing. And we were coming back from the PhillyCon, and I know Van Arnhem was in the car with me, and probably Rich Brown and Mike McInerney and a variety of others, quite possibly even John Boardman. And we, plus Robin, of course, and we started talking about gossip from the convention. And somewhere along the line, it came out that Jack Chalker was going to bid for Baltimore for the '67 WorldCon. Now, none of us had a high opinion of Jack Chalker. At that time, not yet a professional writer, just a fan. And not a very well liked fan either, in my opinion. And we, all of us, were kind of revulsed by the notion of him putting on a WorldCon. It was along the lines of, my God, if Jack Chalker is going to bid for a WorldCon, anybody could bid for a WorldCon. Why, even we could bid for a WorldCon. And that was the genesis of our bid. We started talking about it, and got progressively more serious about it. And my notions of how we should go about it were based on all the prior history of New York fandom and convention bidding. Now, New York fandom was then famous for a very fractured fandom. And this had been true since sometime in the early 40s, if not the 30s, with different fan clubs almost warring with each other. The Will Sycora's Queen's Club against Dave Kyle's Futurians, whatever. You know, there was always this stuff going on. In the 50s, like at the '55 WorldCon, the first one I ever went to, Cleveland, there were bids, but by that point there was the rotation system, and I guess there were bids for the East Coast. I'm not sure. And in any event, when a New York bid was announced, another competing New York bid was also announced from the floor. A lot of this stuff wasn't prepared for much in advance. You know, no progress report advertising. Just, you know, seat of your pants. When you're there, we'll figure it out. And the competing New York bids, of course, canceled each other out. And this was typical of the reputation New York fandom had. Fractious, warring. And what happened when New York City got Nikon 2 in '56? Well, 56, 56, yeah, 56. The convention ended with lawsuits. You know, we had this huge Wisfasink lawsuit where half the committee is suing the other half. And consequently, nobody wanted to see another convention in New York City. So this is what we knew we were up against. But I also thought that there is, I mean, people are always talking about, well, the only way to do this is to have a consolidated bid where we get the Fanoclasts and the Lunarians and ESPA and everybody else in. And I said, no, that's exactly how you get lawsuits. You get people who are nearly totally incompatible with each other trying to work together. You get friction, you get drama, you get problems. We don't need that. Let's stick with the Fanoclast model. The Fanoclast model was there was only one rule. Everybody had to like you. Now, this wasn't adhered to always to the very, very letter, but you could blackball, any member could blackball someone from joining. And only Fred Phillips, in my memory, was ever actually blackballed. Fred Phillips is the guy who coined Pub My Ish. So he is to be remembered for that. But otherwise, no one who had known him for more than 5 minutes wanted him in the club. So we had a group of people who worked pretty well together. We had what I considered a functioning anarchy. Of course, the Fanoclasts had no officers, no official business meetings, none of that crap. So it was easy to kind of mold that into the Nikon 3 bidding committee, which we did, and very successfully, I might say. And we put together a really solid bid. We had Jack Gaughan doing publicity comic books for us. We had Harlan Ellison as one of our nominators at the convention where we were selected. We mounted a pretty slick campaign, and one that we were proud of, and we won the convention. And my notion was, if we're going to do a convention, a Worldcon, we're going to do some things which I wanted to see at conventions, and we're going to not do some of the things I hated seeing at conventions. Top of my list of things I've hated to see at conventions are panels of 5 or more people where only one person dominates throughout. You could just eliminate all the other panel members and just have the moderator and that one person. And what would that be? It would be a dialogue or an interview. So for Nikon 3, we had dialogues and interviews. We had Chip Delaney and Roger Zelazny, the 2 young bloods. We had, who did we pair off Alexei Panshin with? I can't remember anymore, but it was somebody that he was philosophically opposed to. You know, we tried to work it out so it would be interesting. The object of every one of those dialogues was it should always be interesting. And I think they all pretty much were. And it has disturbed me over the years, and I've said this several times recently, it's disturbed me that no one ever picked up on this concept after us. Not one Worldcon and not many regionals either. And it's surely not a unique concept that no one else has thought of. I asked around in the early to mid 70s when friends of mine like the Haldeman's were involved with Worldcons. And what I was hearing is, oh, everything we've heard is that those were a disaster. And then Mike Resnick comes out with a retro con report in Mimosa, I think it was, in which he says the programming at Nikon 3 was dreadful. It was all fan oriented, which was a total lie. The only fan programming was on Thursday. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Isn't that enough for you? Thursday too? I don't know. But I still think it's a very viable concept, and it leads to much better programming than just throwing a half dozen people on a panel willy-nilly and hoping that some of them know how to speak to the audiences, which many of them don't.
I have to say that, I mean, Nikon 3 was my first Worldcon, so I didn't have a lot to go on, but I thought it worked really, really well. And I've also suggested this at times, because who wants to sit there listening to people going, I don't know why I'm here, you know, do you know why I'm here? What are we supposed to be talking about? And only there because they want to be able to say they've been on the program.
Yeah, well, these days I think they're all neo-pros. You know,
Mostly.
they're all pushing their work with hopes of achieving a Hugo sooner, if not later. We've basically gotten up to the 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're going to talk about my fan career, there's a lot more to come.
Mm-hmm.
And we even talk that much about my pro career from the editing point of view, which intersected with you.
Mm-hmm.
When I became the editor of Amazing in 1969, one of the first things I wanted to do was to bring back the Clubhouse. Now, I have to say, I was never that fond of the name, the Clubhouse, because I never thought of fandom as a club per se, more as a community. But still, it had the weight of tradition, and Rog Phillips had done a long series of halfway decent fanzine reviews for Amazing Clubhouse. And then a guy named Rene DeSoto, who probably not his real name, did one briefly in the mid 50s in the Digest Amazing. But there hadn't been any good fanzine review columns and prozines for years. And it just, I've always felt that there needed to be that connection between fandom and prodom. And by bringing that column back, I thought I could do something with it. And I asked John to take it over. And what I don't understand is that John has now kind of disappeared from my screen, and there's a picture of somebody else in his place. I don't get that. I hope John hasn't been turned off. But I will continue by saying that John was our first Clubhouse columnist for Amazing under my editorship. And I thought he did an outstanding job of it. And I followed him when he decided he'd had enough. I serialized the Enchanted Duplicator in the Clubhouse because I thought, why not? It deserves to be read widely. And then I had Ed Smith writing it. And John, you're back.
So yeah, sorry.
Uh,
Had to take a quick break.
and so anyway, Ed Smith took it over for a while, and then Rich Brown. And at some point, Susan Wood, I can't remember where she fit in the sequence, except that she did some good columns, but we were up to 1976 in our anniversary issue, our 50th anniversary issue of Amazing. And she had turned in the column for it. And I'd copy edited it and gone to the typesetter, and the issue was days away from being printed when she suddenly sent me this letter saying, I'm withdrawing my column. I forget her exact reason. I think she wanted to publish it somewhere else. That she had decided that it was such a high quality essay, it shouldn't be wasted on Amazing. I'm not real sure about that. But in any event, she had a hissy fit when I told her that she couldn't withdraw. It was too late. Already, she didn't understand the publishing process. You know, you have months of lead time, and by now we were way past the point where we could pull it. And so she departed Amazing, let us say, under a less than friendly atmosphere on her part, which I always regretted. But I do feel that that was an invaluable column for fandom. I have heard from so many fans over the years, Leah Zelda's not being the least of them, that they got into fandom because of Amazing in that column. You know, that it was their bridge to fandom. And I feel sad that that bridge is no longer in existence and probably never will be again.
I'm always surprised to meet people, or I guess I'm not surprised now, but I have been over the years, you know, fans that I've come to know and get friends with, and they'll say casually, oh yeah, I started getting into fandom by reading your columns. That's great. It's wonderful. Okay, let's move a little bit forward to Falls Church fandom and Pong and Blatt and what you were doing in the 70s.
I thought you were going to move on to my collaborations editorial.
We can do that.
Include you.
Yeah.
Let me just say the first one was Bob Stewart, the guy who spells his name Bhob. And that was back when I was doing Zip. And Bob was one of my first fan correspondents. We met in the pages of Brevazine, and Bob was putting out a little hectograph fanzine then. It was too much work, the hectographing. So he offered me all the material that he had accumulated for his next issue, some of it on master, and some really nice artwork by Bobby Jean Warner, by the way. And so de facto, I made him my co-editor of Zip for at least a while, but that was his only contribution. Stellar, Larry Stark was co-editor to begin with, and actually did a fair amount of real editing on the two or so issues that he was involved with. But then when he left, I completely took over. Then I was on my own until Void, and basically, Greg Benford offered me Void, basically asked me to take it over, and I insisted to stay on as co-editor and at least be a columnist, and which he was. And I hoped that his editorial presence would generate more material because he had contacts I didn't have. But that never actually happened. So basically, I edited Void. Basically, I was always Void's editor from the point I became its publisher onwards. But subsequently, Pete Graham joined the editorial staff mainly by joining in on stencil typing during the Anish that we did, the Vanish, which came out in 3 parts. And somewhere in the second or third part, Pete became a member of the Void staff. Well, now Pete was living in New York City at the time, so he was somebody I could hang out with. It wasn't long distance like it was with Greg. And then when Terry Carr moved to New York City, largely at my behest, he was sharing Pete's apartment with Pete at first, and at that time I had Towner Hall. Now we haven't actually talked about Towner Hall, but we probably should because it was important in its time.
Yeah.
Towner Hall was my Mimeo shop that I set up on West 10th Street, right around the corner from 7th Avenue, about 2 or 3 blocks from my apartment. It had been a basement restaurant, and we had to get a lot of grease off the walls before we could even paint it. But I had set it up as a Mimeo shop because I was trying to get subsidiary work as a mimeographer doing the kind of stuff I'd done in Falls Church, daily menus for restaurants, that kind of thing. And in simple fact, the place never paid for itself. But it very quickly became a fanish hangout because I had these desks and these typewriters and this mimeograph and this light scope on a table and all the rest of that stuff and lots of lettering guides and shading plates. And people would come there to publish their fanzines. Jeff Wanchel put out his fanzine there. Mike McInerney put out, I think, the first or second issue of his fanzine there, Pickle Plod, and various other people. And of course, Pete was doing his Fapazine, which was then Lighthouse. And when Terry came there, Terry was doing stuff. So Terry would, I gave several people keys to the place. Terry was one of them. Terry would come over in the late morning and work on his stories before anyone else showed up. I usually come in around 1 o'clock, and Pete would show up now and then. I think he did have some regular employment or something somewhere else, so he would more likely be in the evening. And Bob Stewart would come by frequently. Bob, in fact, had a key. And Les Gerber, Andy Reese, varieties of other people would show up, and it became a fan hangout. And it, as its height as a fan out, we hosted the Fanoclasts there. You know, the Lupos were the original hosts of the Fanoclasts. And then after their second child was born, they decided they did not want to be Fanoclast hosts anymore. So briefly, for the summer of 61, for maybe 2 or 3 months, the Fanoclast meetings actually met at Town Hall. That's when Lee Hoffman started coming. Lee had been avoiding them previously because Larry Shaw was a founding member and Lee was avoiding Larry. But Larry was out on Staten Island and not coming to Fanoclast meetings anymore. He only came to the first few. And so Lee started showing up, and that was great. But we really needed not to meet in an office, basically. So then Lynn Carter took over the Fanoclasts, and he lived up in the Bronx, and we met there for, I don't know, more than a year, I think. And then eventually the Fanoclasts, Lynn didn't want to have him anymore. I think he was getting involved with a new one, about to move out to Queens. So I started hosting the Fanoclasts at my apartment in Brooklyn. I had moved to Brooklyn in early '62 because I couldn't afford Town Hall anymore. It was real simple. And I couldn't consolidate everything back into my fourth floor apartment on Christopher Street either. I had too much accumulated furniture and stuff, plus 4 flights of stairs. So I had started looking in Brooklyn for an apartment, and I lucked into an ideal apartment, a first floor with furnished basement apartment, 7 rooms, backyard, back porch, pear tree in the backyard, really nice. So at that point, I could start hosting Fanoclast meetings myself. No one really wanted to climb 4 flights of stairs for me. And so, you know, it all ties together, the Fanoclasts and Town Hall and all the rest of it. Then the Fanoclast stayed with me until I left New York City in 1970, at which point I had, quote, sold, unquote, my apartment to Steve Stiles, and he just continued hosting the meetings there. When he left, Ross Chamberlain did, so forth and so on. So that was a meeting spot for the Fanoclast for probably at least 10 years, which in New York City is an epic amount of time for any fan club meeting in one spot.
I took it for granted because that's how I started. I'm, you know, coming in from Bronxville to Grand Central and then schlepping out to Brooklyn on the subway and loving it. It was like the bohemian life for me as a suburban kid. And of course, it would have been nicer if it had been in the village, but
Would have been close.
yeah, definitely. I learned quickly that there was a certain point, because they had all-night trains at that point back to Westchester, which was only true for a few years, but they ran once an hour and then skipped, I think, 4 a.m. So I learned I had to leave an hour before my train or I'd get back. If I pushed it by 10 minutes, I'd miss it.
I learned something similar about the train on Staten Island. I used to go out and visit Larry and Marion Shaw a lot. In fact, for a while, I kept my car out there when I was living in the village. And so Larry could use it to do his grocery shopping and stuff like that. And one night I stayed there. I don't remember now what the deadline was. Might have been 2 a.m. Whatever it was, I ended up waiting 3 or 4 hours in this little station on the Staten Island Railroad. So not pleasant. But getting back to what we had been talking about, collaborations. I had really finished up on that because in the early 60s, after Void kind of went into a hiatus, Les Gerber and I started up Minac, which Richard Bergeron referred to as an N small fanzine. I believe that may have been the first time that term was used. But it was, our concept was, it was like a bigger fanzine, but it was only maybe 6 to 10 pages long, and it would have editorials, columns, and letters, but all in that space. Terry Carr did a fanzine review column for it, as a matter of fact. And it was fun doing, but then the boondoggle happened, the whole 1964 nonsense. I don't know whether we want to go into that because it's a long digression, but I'll just say that it killed me. We got involved in the arguments, and it wiped out our joy in the fanzine. So Minac died then.
Mhm.
And a few years later, well, at one point, Rich Brown and I were talking about doing a collaboration, maybe a three-way with Andy Main, I think maybe. It was going to be called Beard Mutterings, which was later used for himself. But that we never actually got that off the ground. I mean, we talked about it. We didn't actually do it. So it wasn't until you came along, John, that I proposed, and I don't even remember now the circumstances in which I proposed doing Igaboo with you, except that by
Not
then
either.
starting to get into really good generic fanzine titles.
I think well, I'm sure it must have been at a Fanoclast meeting, but I had started doing a letter substitute that I called Maverick, and I'd only done like 2 or 3 issues. I think I used the title before, and you said, we could do this together. I think that's how it started. We started Igaboo, summer of '68,
Yeah.
when I was back in New York from college, and so we could do it every couple of weeks. Of course, once I've been back to California, that schedule slipped. Yeah.
The first incarnation of Igaboo, I would say I was the editor in chief and you were the columnist. But then second incarnation, after I moved to Virginia, you were I mean, I still mimeoed it, but you were the editor in chief. You put it together. And I thought you did a really good job of it too. You were using Greg Calkins' Oopslaw model.
Yeah.
I think it's an excellent model for a Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
Which is basically editorial content, letters, 1 or 2 good columnists, and an article.
Mm-hmm. That was it. And it would be like 24-page because that would fit into the postal weight. And either you were mimeoing them when I was back east, or at least 1, possibly 2 issues were mimeoed. I mimeoed on Bill Blackbeard's mimeo in San Francisco.
I'd forgotten. I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, I actually just happened to be looking at the issue, which was mentioning that the previous one had been done there, and this one was going to be, but I didn't get around to it, and I was back east, so we made a little change, and you mimeoed it. So that's fresh in my mind because I was just looking at it.
I have this memory of you and I sitting at my big oval dining room table, you at one end and me at the other, both of us with typewriters.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Those were the days, my friend. That takes us up to Fabulous Falls Church fandom, too.
Mm-hmm. With one digression, there was Void 29.
Yes.
Which grew out of conversations at your New Year's party. I guess it was the 68, 69? Yeah, would it be?
Yeah.
Yep. Because I remember I went at midnight, my N3F membership expired. So I went from being an N3F member to a Void boy.
Well, see, in those days, I threw one party a year to which all of New York fandom was invited, no restrictions, and that was my New Year's Eve party. Mm-hmm. And those were very successful parties. I had them for, I don't know, more than 5 years. I don't remember exactly when they started, but you were there, and Arnie Katz was there, and the subject came up that I had half finished the issue, that a
Hmm.
third of it was run off, and another third was on stencils, and the rest of it still had to be stenciled. Um, but and just in conversation, one of you guys, you or Arnie, you were both pretty gung ho then, said, "Well, let's finish it up. Let's do it." So
Hmm.
for that holiday period, was it basically a weekend? It's hard to remember, but
Pretty much, I think,
you
because
guys
it
were,
had to be before I went back for college. It might have been a week because I think it started a little after New Year's.
but we
But yeah, pretty fast, pretty damn
cranked
fast.
the whole issue out in a very short period of time. I mean, just sitting down and doing the work, what it took,
Hmm.
and we put it out.
And it
Well,
was so quick that you.
29, many coincidences. That's the one where I wrote all of Greg's editorial material because we didn't have time to ask him to write it by mail and then have him send it back by mail. I mean, that would have been insane. That would have been more than a week.
Mhm.
But
Yep.
in those days, nobody made long distance phone calls.
Right. And I remember you were saying, well, I'm not going to try to imitate Greg's style, although, of course, you'd written each other's stuff way back earlier. I'll just write in the style that we both admire. So I think you were using a Raymond Chandler-esque style for it. And I got to take it to him when I went back to the Bay Area for his copy of Void 29, which he knew nothing about. He was just flabbergasted. But he also looked at it and went, wait, did I write this?
Well, some of it he kind of did because what I did was
Hmm.
there were like 3 or 4 separate little pieces within it, which is our
Hmm.
style then. And at least one of them I based on a piece he'd actually had in an earlier issue that I rewrote. I kind of wrote a parallel piece, you might say, to it. It's very much
Uh,
a style and all this or that. But he didn't actually write a word originally in that editorial. I wrote all of it. I don't think Terry did anything, did he? Did Terry come over while we were doing all that? I know he wrote his own piece.
He he did, but I think he just came over to deliver his editorial. I don't think he really participated in the process, if I remember right.
Yeah, he was a
Because he
big.
did write. Hmm.
I mean, seriously, we both were, but he got the acclaim and respect, and I did. I mean, Ace Specials was a big deal. Amazing and Fantastic were crap. That was how the SF establishment saw us both. I got to drive Terry to Milford for a Milford conference. I couldn't stay. I could just go and pick him up after. You know, Carol could stay. I couldn't. Why? Because I had this piece in White House #2, Pete Graham's Papazine, all about a Hydra Club party in New York City in 1960, before the '60 Worldcon in Pittsburgh. And I said some unkind things about Judy Merrill. True, but unkind. After that was published, Jim Blish and Avram Davidson took me to lunch in Dutch Uncle's Big. Basically, what they said is, Ted, just because it's true doesn't mean you have to say it. Which I recognized more wisdom to at the time, but it was always my hallmark to say things that other people weren't quite willing to say. And that was an example that was to bite me in the ass and follow me throughout my professional career. I was always shunned the Milford Mafia. And my magazine, you didn't find them contributing to my magazines even when I was 100% new material. I mean, they must have had some unsold stuff that they could have tried me with because it was too far out for the other editors. characters, but they didn't. They didn't need to. They didn't want to, and they did. So that was the way of things. There's always been a lot of politics in the SF community. Some of it I have really been disgusted by. For instance, until the mafia found out that Chip Delaney was black, they shunned him too. They shunned him as an Ace Books author. And Ace Books was five of the heap as far as they were concerned. It wasn't until he went to the 66th Worldcon in Cleveland and people found out he was black that they began to lionize him. All of them. They adopted him. They made him their pet. Chip and I used to talk about this, because he and I were friends before all that. He used to come over to my house. He taught me how to make garlic soup.
Mm.
We did a lot of hanging out. He and I both heard Sergeant Pepper for the first time together when he was at my house, and Alexei Panchim called me up and told me to turn on the radio. Murray the K was playing the new Beatles out, which he did straight through both sides, uninterrupted. And so, I feel like some of us genuinely valued Chip for who and what he was as a person. I always liked him as a person. I never liked his fiction much. I met his wife, Marilyn Hacker. I mimeographed a poetry zine of hers for her. All of this went on, but I was unclean to the mafia. And to a certain extent, I'm still bitter about it. But hey, I'm still alive. Most of
Right.
and so it doesn't really matter anymore, one way or the other.
There are many advantages to the small size of fandom in the science fiction community, especially in the old days, but that's the disadvantage, just like any small town. When you get people fighting with each other, they don't forget.
Yeah. Now we have sidetracked here. We haven't finished my fanzine collaborations yet.
Right.
Namely, after Igaboo was Pong. And Pong was me saying, and when was it, 80 or 81?
Something like that.
I was saying to my friends and fellow inhabitants of Fabulous Falls Church fandom, which we'll have to get to eventually, energy level in fanzines is really, really low now. All of the better fanzines are coming out annually or less than annually. There's nothing frequent. There's nothing interesting going on a day-to-day basis in fanzines. And I can remember back in the day when there were lots of little frequent fanzines. There was a guy named Bob Petrusky who did a fanzine called Confab in the early, maybe 52, something like that. It was a letter zine. Came out, I don't know, either monthly or more frequently than monthly. It might have been bi-weekly. I don't remember, but I do remember always enjoying it when it showed up. It just made you feel connected. And there was nothing like that going on there. So I turned to Dan Steffen. Now, I should mention in preface that at that point, I had known Dan for 6, 8 years. I think we met face to face in '73 in Toronto at the Worldcon. But in '75, he moved to the DC area, to Northern Virginia. In fact, for a time, he stayed in my house. And actually, for several different times, he stayed in my house. And Dan, when I first met him, was, let us just say, pretty young. but he outgrew that, as we all do. And by 1980 or 81, whenever it was, I think it was 80, um, he he had developed. He had put out a really decent fanzine called Boone Park by then, to which I was a contributor, and all the various other projects from. And he and I hung out a lot together. I mean, we listened to recordings together. We played card games together. We went to movies together. We went to clubs and shows together. Uh, he met Lynn, his wife, through me because I had met her through my radio station connection, something else we haven't talked about. And Dan was the inevitable person to turn to and say, uh, let's do a little snappy fanzine together. Now, the name Pong originally occurred to me. Well, it has many derivations to other people, but to me, its derivation is Spanish. It was Bob Tucker's 30s pseudonym, Hoy Ping Pong. And basically, with Hoy Ping Pong, Bob Tucker, the letter columns of the prozines of the day, created Spanish fandom. He started the Staple Wars with Don Wilhelm, which was a mock feud, which was very funny, carried to interesting lengths. And I've always felt that Bob Tucker was the ultimate prototypical fan, the fan who was pretty much good at everything he did and became a pro and was a damn good pro as well. Yeah, but he didn't turn his back on fandom like so many pros do. and both Terry Carr and I, to a large extent, modeled our careers on Bob Tucker's as well as we could. And so in 1967, when I was chairing that Worldcon, I wanted to improve the Hugo situation on the fan side. We had all these pro Hugos and just one fan Hugo for fanzine. And so I proposed adding fan writer and fan artist to that list. But at the same time, I didn't really think, I thought they should all be science fiction achievement awards, which is what the Hugos really are. But I saw no reason to call them Hugos because in fandom, we're not honoring Hugo Gernsback. We're honoring fandom and fans. Who more to honor the name than Bob Tucker? But he's alive. You don't want to call it the Tucker Award or something, so you call it the Pong. And I wanted to call the three fan heroes Pongs. But I was short-stopped on this by a fan named Bill Millardi, who was then publishing a fanzine called Double Bill with Bill Bowers. And they had that year managed to get onto the ballot for best fanzine, the Hugo ballot. And Millardi was absolutely adamant that he was not going to be awarded a Hugo, a Pong. It had to be a Hugo. And there was a vigorous campaign mounted both before the convention and at the business session at the convention where these things were being ratified. And the three categories were ratified, but they were all called Hugos. So Pong went wanting as a name. And so here Dan and I are in 1980 thinking about a small sappy fanzine. And we want a short, one word, 4 or 5 letter title. And Pong was the natural thing that came to mind. So we created Pong. And the original idea was 4 to 6 pages of short, snappy stuff done weekly. Every week you got a new issue. They weren't big, they weren't ambitious, there wasn't a lot in them, but they came every week. And that was the point. Pump up the energy level. Now, I'm not sure we succeeded in actually pumping up the energy level all that much. Nobody, when we stopped, picked up after we left off, or the Nielsen Hayden's haphazardly. Izzard. But Izzard never
Uh,
came out often. Hmm?
um, 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 suddenly I'm going blank. Um, Alan. Um,
Oh, yeah. I know what you're talking about. Alan Rosenthal or
no, no.
somebody else in the Nielsen Hayden branch of fan.
He started, and I'm blanking out on the title now. It wasn't great, but he did try to pick it up.
That was it in 79 and 80. That's while I was at Heavy Mill.
Oh,
I actually
okay.
contributed some to it, and I urged him to continue, but he didn't. And that's one of the reasons he decided to do Pong.
What
So at
was the
any
what
rate,
was the hmm,
I
what
can
was the timing in terms of when some of us, Rich Code had a whole bunch of his British rat zines from the 70s, which most of us had never gotten, and he was loaning that around. People were reading them, and
I
there was
know
definitely it was definitely an influence on the West Coast. We were
that,
inspired again by Blatt.
that's serious digression. Let's get back on track here. We haven't finished with Pong. Pong
Oh,
was it didn't really, I think, pump up the energy level that much, but it accomplished something much more significant. And that was the rapprochement between British and American fandoms, which at that time were pretty much going their separate ways. Rat fandom had very little connection with North American fandom. Almost none. There were like two American fans, Terry Hughes and Mike Luxon, who were getting Rat fanzines. And Dan knew more about then contemporary British fandom than I did. And he put together a mailing list. And he was instrumental in getting these people more involved. This is how I got to meet and know people like Rob Hansen, as well as just about everybody else who was like post 60s in British fandom. Even though I knew of some of them, I mean, I knew of Malcolm Edwards. I had gotten not only issues of Inca, but issues of Zimri and some of the others, but not the good rat zines. And that was an eye opener for me. I thoroughly enjoyed discovering rat fandom. And just as a postscript, I also thoroughly enjoyed discovering cretin fandom, which was created briefly by some Scottish fans who reinvented Spanish fandom themselves and did a brilliant job of it. In any event, the thing about Pong was that when we started, Dan was theoretically writing half of it. But in actual fact, I was rewriting everything by him. I mean, when we were putting it on stencil, I was retyping him on stencil and rewriting as I went. And I often would just take the germ of an idea from something he had and blow that up into a piece, ignoring what he had really done with it. But in the process of all this, Dan observed what I was doing with his work, and he learned from it. And he learned significantly from it. And by the time we were finishing Pong, I wasn't doing nearly the rewriting I'd been doing at the beginning. And then later on, when we decided to do Black, now Black was a real full-fledged collaborative co-editorship. Dan did at least half the editing and very well too.